When I first moved to Serenity Lane, I thought it would be the perfect place to start fresh. After years of stressful days in courtrooms, ruling on cases that often left me emotionally drained, I was ready for something quieter. This little neighborhood seemed like a dream come true. Tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and homes with neat gardens. It wasn't fancy or over the top. It was simple, peaceful, and exactly what I needed. The house itself was cozy, with just enough space for me to feel comfortable but not overwhelmed. There was a small backyard where I imagined the fire that destroyed my garden shed left me shaken. It wasn't just the shock of seeing something I owned turn to ashes. It was the message behind it. Join or burn. 4 simple words, painted in bold red letters, but they carried a weight that made my stomach churn. This wasn't some random act of vandalism. It was a threat, a warning, and it came directly from the people who were supposed to be my neighbors. I called the police right away, though I didn't hold out much hope for results. Sure enough, when Detective Harris showed up, he looked at the scene with a mix of boredom and skepticism. "Probably kids messing around," he said, jotting down notes without even glancing at me. I wanted to argue, to tell him this was clearly targeted, but what could I say? That the HOA had burned my shed because I refused to join them. Even as the words formed in my mind, they sounded ridiculous. Who would believe me? The days that followed were tense. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, watching, waiting. Neighbors avoided eye contact or offered awkward smiles before hurrying away. The once friendly atmosphere of Serenity Lane now felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew something I didn't, like they were part of some unspoken agreement I hadn't been invited to join. Then came the smaller acts of harassment. One morning, I found dead flowers scattered across my front porch. Another day, someone slashed the tires on my car. Each incident felt like a slap in the face, designed not to destroy me outright, but to wear me down. It was psychological warfare, plain and simple. They wanted me to feel powerless, to break under the pressure. But instead of crumbling, I grew angrier. Every act of aggression only fueled my determination to stand my ground. I started documenting everything, taking photos of the damage, saving every threatening note, writing detailed accounts of each incident. If they thought they could scare me into submission, they were wrong. I'd spent years ruling over courtrooms, dealing with people who tried to manipulate the system for their own gain. These tactics might work on others, but they wouldn't work on me. One evening, as I sat in my living room going over the evidence I'd collected, Sarah, my daughter, walked in. She's in her early 20s, fiercely independent, and has always admired how I handle tough situations. But tonight, she looked worried. "Mom," she said softly, sitting beside me, "this isn't worth it. Just pay the dues or whatever they want. It's not like you need the headache." Her words stung, not because she was wrong, but because she was right, at least in a way. Joining the HOA would have been easier. Paying their fees, following their rules, and staying out of their way would have saved me a lot of trouble. But giving in meant letting them win. It meant admitting that they had power over me. And I couldn't do that. Not here. Not now. "I'm not doing this just for me," I told her, setting the papers aside. "This is about standing up for what's right. If I back down, what's stopping them from doing this to someone else? What happens when they decide another neighbor isn't compliant enough?" Sarah didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at the stack of documents, her brow furrowed. Finally, she sighed. "Just promise me you'll be careful, okay? These people are dangerous." She was right, of course. Dangerous wasn't a word I'd normally associate with a group of suburban homeowners, but it fit. Their actions weren't just petty annoyances. They were calculated attempts to intimidate and control. And yet, despite the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Something inside me refused to let them win. As the days passed, the tension continued to build. More notes appeared, more subtle threats. My mailbox was dented one morning, and the next, someone spray-painted non-compliant on my garage door. Each new attack pushed me closer to a breaking point, but also deeper into resolve. I began researching legal options, looking for ways to fight back without revealing my identity as a judge. After all, part of me still wondered, if they knew who I really was, would they stop? Or would it make things worse? The harassment kept coming, relentless and cruel. Every morning felt like opening a new chapter in a story I didn't want to read. One day, it was a pile of dead leaves dumped on my doorstep with a note that read, "Clean up your act." Another day, someone filled my mailbox with dirt, literally shoveling soil into it until it overflowed. The message was clear. They weren't just trying to annoy me. They were trying to break me. I tried talking to some of the neighbors, hoping at least one of them would admit what was going on. But every conversation ended the same way, with awkward silences or quick excuses to leave. Mrs. Patel, who lived across the street, gave me a sympathetic look once but said nothing. Even Mr. Harper, an older man who always waved hello, avoided eye contact when I passed him on the sidewalk. It was as if they'd all been warned not to get involved. Detective Harris stopped by again after another report, a rock thrown through my living room window this time. But his attitude hadn't changed. "These things happen," he said with a shrug, glancing at the shattered glass. "Kids, probably. Or maybe animals. Animals. In suburban Serenity Lane." He might as well have told me aliens did it for how believable that sounded. What frustrated me most wasn't just the vandalism. It was the isolation. These people weren't strangers. They were my neighbors. We shared the same streets, the same parks, the same sense of community, or so I thought. Now it felt like I was living in enemy territory, surrounded by people too afraid to speak up. Did they agree with the HOA's tactics, or were they just scared of becoming targets themselves? Then came the fire, the one that changed everything. It happened late at night, when the world outside seemed eerily quiet. I woke up to the smell of smoke, thick and choking, filling the air. My heart pounded as I bolted out of bed and ran downstairs. Flames were already licking at the side of the house, spreading fast. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my hands trembling as I stumbled outside in my pajamas. Neighbors began to gather, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow. Some looked genuinely horrified, while others stood silently, arms crossed, watching the blaze consume my home. Firefighters arrived quickly, but by then, the damage was done. Half the house was gone, reduced to charred rubble. Everything inside, my furniture, my clothes, my books, was either destroyed or soaked beyond repair. As I stood there barefoot on the cold pavement, wrapped in a blanket a neighbor had handed me, I couldn't help but notice the reactions around me. A few people whispered apologies, offering to help however they could. Others stared blankly, their expressions unreadable. And then there were those who didn't even bother pretending to care. Mr. Grayson, the HOA president, lingered near the back of the crowd, his face carefully neutral. He didn't say a word, but his presence spoke volumes. Later, Detective Harris showed up again, shaking his head as he surveyed the wreckage. "Looks like faulty wiring," he muttered, jotting notes in his pad. Faulty wiring. Right. Because houses just spontaneously burst into flames all the time. I wanted to scream, to shout that this wasn't an accident. It was arson, plain and simple. But I bit my tongue. Arguing wouldn't change anything. Not yet, anyway. That night, sitting in a motel room paid for by the Red Cross, I let the weight of everything crash over me. This wasn't just about rules or compliance anymore. This was personal. They had burned my house down, my home. And for what? Because I refused to join their little club. Because I dared to stand up to them. For the first time since moving to Serenity Lane, I felt truly alone. Sarah called me later, her voice cracking with worry. "Mom, please tell me you're okay," she said. I assured her I was fine, though we both knew it was a lie. Physically, I was unharmed, but emotionally, I was shattered. But even in my darkest moments, something inside me refused to give up. If they thought burning my house would scare me into submission, they were wrong. Dead wrong. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke up with a strange clarity. The motel room was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional car passing by outside. My mind raced as I replayed everything that had happened. The threats, the vandalism, the fire. It all pointed to one conclusion. The HOA wasn't just some overzealous group of homeowners enforcing rules. They were bullies, wielding power in ways that crossed every line of decency. But here's the thing about bullies. They thrive on fear, and I realized something important. I wasn't afraid anymore. Oh, I was angry, hurt, and exhausted, but fear? No, not anymore. What they'd done to me, burning my house, destroying my belongings, isolating me from the community, had gone too far. If they thought this would break me, they underestimated who I really was. I decided it was time to stop playing defense and start fighting back. But how? I couldn't march into the HOA office and demand answers. That would be too easy for them to dismiss. I needed proof, hard evidence that tied them directly to the harassment and the fire. And I needed allies, though finding anyone willing to stand with me felt like searching for a needle in a haystack. That's when I remembered Mrs. Harper, the elderly widow who lived 2 doors down. She had always struck me as kind but reserved, someone who kept to herself, but occasionally exchanged pleasantries. During the fire, she hadn't said much, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of guilt or maybe concern, that stuck with me. Maybe she knew more than she let on. Later that afternoon, I walked over to her house, clutching a box of cookies I'd picked up at the grocery store. When she opened the door, her expression shifted from surprise to wariness. "Hello, dear," she said softly, glancing behind me as if expecting someone else. "What brings you here?" "I'm sorry to bother you," I began, holding out the cookies. "I just wanted to thank you for the blanket last night. It meant a lot." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she invited me inside. Her living room was cozy, filled with knickknacks and framed photos of family members. As we sat down, I took a deep breath. "Mrs. Harper, can I ask you something? Do you know anything about what's been happening on the street lately?" She hesitated, her hands trembling around the teacup she'd brought in. For a moment, I thought she might deny knowing anything, but then she sighed heavily. "It's not safe to talk about these things," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're watching everyone." "Who is they?" I pressed gently, leaning forward. "The HOA." She nodded slowly, her eyes darting toward the window. "Mr. Grayson and his friends. They've been running things for years. At first, it was harmless enough. Rules about paint colors and lawn care. But lately, her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. It's gotten worse. Much worse." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "They target people," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Anyone who doesn't follow their rules, or anyone they think might cause trouble. Like you." My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Do you know why they burned my house?" She hesitated again, clearly torn between loyalty and conscience. Finally, she whispered, "They saw you as a threat, someone who wouldn't back down. They thought if they scared you enough, you'd leave." "And the fire?" I prodded. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked away. "I shouldn't have told you this," she murmured. "Please, don't mention my name. You don't understand what they're capable of." Before I could respond, she stood abruptly, signaling that our conversation was over. As I left her house, my mind buzzed with possibilities. Mrs. Harper hadn't given me concrete evidence, but she'd confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA was behind everything. More importantly, she hinted at something bigger, a web of control and intimidation that went far beyond silly neighborhood rules. Back at the motel, I pulled out my laptop and started digging deeper. I searched public records, financial filings, anything related to the HOA. Late into the night, I pored over documents, piecing together clues. By the time I finally closed my laptop, my eyes burned with exhaustion. But I had found something big. The HOA wasn't just collecting dues. They were funneling money into offshore accounts. Payments labeled as maintenance fees were being sent to shell companies with no clear purpose. It wasn't definitive proof yet, but it was enough to make me wonder, was this about power, greed, or both? Whatever the answer, one thing was certain. I wasn't backing down now. The next few days were a blur of late nights and endless research. I became obsessed with uncovering the truth about the HOA, poring over every document I could find online. Public records, meeting minutes, financial statements, anything that might shed light on their operations. It wasn't easy. Most of the information was buried under layers of jargon and red tape. But slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. One name kept popping up, Mr. Grayson. He wasn't just the president of the HOA. He was also listed as a signatory on multiple bank accounts tied to the organization. And those accounts, they weren't ordinary savings or checking accounts. Money flowed in and out of them like water, often disappearing into shell companies with vague names like Serenity Lane Maintenance LLC or Community Improvement Fund. None of it added up. Why would an HOA need so many offshore transactions? Then there were the insurance policies. As I dug deeper, I discovered something alarming. The HOA had taken out hefty insurance plans on nearly every property in the neighborhood, including mine. At first glance, it seemed harmless enough. Homeowners associations sometimes did this to cover potential liabilities, right? But the amounts were staggering, far exceeding the actual value of the homes. It didn't take long for me to connect the dots. If a house burned down or was otherwise destroyed, the HOA stood to profit. A lot. This revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Suddenly, everything made sense. The threats, the vandalism, the fire, it wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated greed. These people weren't just trying to enforce rules. They were manipulating situations to line their own pockets. My house burning down wasn't just an act of intimidation. It was a business decision. But proving it wouldn't be easy. I needed more than circumstantial evidence. I needed someone willing to testify, to confirm what I already suspected. That's when I remembered Mrs. Harper's confession. She had seen things, heard things. If anyone could corroborate my findings, it was her. I decided to pay her another visit, this time armed with what I'd uncovered. When she answered the door, her face fell immediately. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I know you're scared," I said gently, stepping inside before she could protest. "But I need your help. You told me they saw me as a threat. Can you tell me why?" She hesitated, wringing her hands together. Finally, she nodded toward the kitchen table, where we sat down. For several minutes she stared at her clasped hands, gathering her courage. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to talk. "They've been planning this for years," she said, her words spilling out in fragments. "It started small. At first, it was just fines for minor infractions. People who couldn't pay were pressured to sell their homes cheaply. The board members would buy them, renovate them, and flip them for huge profits." "And the fires?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Her eyes filled with tears. When fines didn't work, they resorted to other methods. Houses that burned down mysteriously always had large insurance payouts. No one ever questioned it because, well, who would suspect the HOA? My blood ran cold. This wasn't just corruption, it was criminal. Arson, fraud, extortion. The list went on. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "Mrs. Harper, if you testify, if you tell the authorities what you know, we can stop them. Together." She shook her head violently, panic flashing across her face. "I can't. They'll ruin me. Or worse. Her fear was palpable, but I understood it. These people had built a system designed to silence dissent. Speaking out came with risks, not just for her, but for anyone brave enough to challenge them. Still, I couldn't give up. Not now. Okay, I said softly, placing a reassuring hand on hers. You don't have to decide right now. Just think about it. What they're doing isn't just wrong. It's dangerous. And if we don't stop them, they'll keep hurting people. As I left her house, my mind raced with possibilities. Mrs. Harper might not be ready to come forward yet, but she had given me something invaluable. Confirmation. Now, it was up to me to build a case strong enough to bring these criminals to justice. Whatever it took, I was prepared to see it through. With Mrs. Harper's words echoing in my mind, I knew I had to act quickly. The evidence I'd gathered was damning, but it wasn't enough on its own. I needed a plan, a way to expose the HOA without tipping them off. If they found out what I was doing, there was no telling how far they'd go to silence me. So, I decided to play my cards carefully. First, I reached out to an old colleague from my days as a judge, a lawyer named Marcus who specialized in civil litigation. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I called him, he agreed to meet me at a quiet cafe downtown. Over coffee, I laid out everything. The harassment, the fire, the suspicious financial transactions. At first, Marcus looked skeptical, raising an eyebrow as if he thought I'd lost my mind. But when I showed him the documents I'd uncovered, the offshore accounts, the inflated insurance policies, he leaned back in his chair stunned. "This is bigger than I thought," he admitted, flipping through the papers. "If even half of this is true, these people are running a criminal enterprise." "Exactly," I said, leaning forward. "And I need your help to prove it." Marcus agreed to take on the case, but he warned me that it wouldn't be easy. Convincing authorities to investigate the HOA would require more than just financial records. We needed witnesses, people willing to testify under oath about what they'd seen or experienced. That's where things got tricky. I spent the next few days reaching out to neighbors, cautiously probing for anyone else who might have been targeted by the HOA. Some refused to talk altogether, clearly too afraid to say anything. Others gave vague answers, hinting at problems but stopping short of naming names. It was frustrating, like trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. Then, unexpectedly, someone came forward. Emily Carter, a young mother who lived 3 houses down, approached me one evening while I was sitting on the motel balcony. She looked nervous, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out and stop her. "I heard about your house," she began hesitantly. "And I think I know why they did it." Her story matched what Mrs. Harper had told me. The HOA had fined her repeatedly over minor infractions, overgrown bushes, mismatched curtains, even a cracked sidewalk. When she couldn't pay, they threatened foreclosure unless she sold her home to them below market value. She didn't have proof, but she was willing to testify if it meant stopping them. Emily's courage emboldened me. Over the following week, I managed to gather statements from 2 other neighbors who had faced similar pressures. Each account added weight to our case, painting a picture of systematic abuse and manipulation. By the time we filed our lawsuit against the HOA, we had a solid foundation to stand on. The day the complaint was officially submitted, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief because we were finally taking action. Dread because I knew the battle was far from over. The HOA wouldn't go down without a fight. They'd pull every trick in the book to discredit us, intimidate witnesses, and bury the truth. But something inside me had shifted. For so long, I'd let fear dictate my actions, or rather, the fear of others. Now I realize that justice doesn't wait for permission. It demands action, even when the odds seem impossible. As I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, reporters trailing behind me, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe Serenity Lane could be saved after all. And maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim the peace I'd come here searching for. The weeks that followed the lawsuit filing were a whirlwind of media attention, whispered rumors, and escalating tension. Serenity Lane, once a quiet neighborhood where nothing seemed out of place, became the center of national headlines. Reporters camped outside my motel room, eager for sound bites about the judge who took on her HOA. Neighbors who had previously avoided me now approached cautiously, some offering support, others casting suspicious glances, as if unsure whether to cheer or fear me. Meanwhile, the HOA didn't stay silent. They issued formal statements denying all allegations, calling the lawsuit frivolous and baseless. Mr. Grayson appeared on local news, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath. "We're here to protect property values and maintain community standards," he said smoothly, his tone dripping with practiced sincerity. "This is nothing more than a personal vendetta." But I knew better. The evidence we gathered spoke louder than their denials. Financial records showed money funneled into offshore accounts. Witness testimonies detailed patterns of harassment and coercion. Even anonymous tips began pouring in. Former board members, disgruntled neighbors, and even a contractor who admitted to being paid off to start fires. Piece by piece, the facade of the HOA crumbled. The turning point came during the trial itself. Mrs. Harper, despite her initial fears, found the courage to testify. Her voice trembled as she recounted meetings where board members discussed targeting problematic homeowners. She described how they justified their actions as necessary for the greater good, framing their greed as altruism. When asked directly if she believed the HOA had orchestrated the fire at my house, she nodded tearfully. "Yes," she whispered. "They thought it would send a message." Emily Carter also took the stand, her bravery inspiring others to come forward. By the end of the trial, nearly a dozen neighbors had shared their stories, exposing years of intimidation and abuse. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief as the full scope of the HOA's corruption unfolded. In the end, justice prevailed. The jury returned a guilty verdict, finding the HOA liable for arson, fraud, and racketeering. Fines were levied, assets seized, and criminal charges filed against key members, including Mr. Grayson. The victory was bittersweet. It couldn't undo the damage done to my home or restore the sense of trust shattered within the community. But it was a start. As the dust settled, life on Serenity Lane began to change. Neighbors who had once been divided started talking again, sharing stories, and rebuilding connections. Some moved away, unable to forget the pain of what had happened, but many stayed, determined to heal together. Slowly, the street regained its charm, not through enforced perfection, but through genuine effort. For me, the experience was transformative. I rebuilt my house, designing it with fireproof materials and large windows that let in sunlight. It wasn't just a physical structure anymore. It was a symbol of resilience. Every nail hammered, every wall painted, reminded me of how far I'd come. One evening, as I sat on my newly finished porch watching the sunset, Detective Harris stopped by. He looked different this time, less skeptical, more reflective. "You really did it," he said, tipping his hat. "Took guts to stand up like that." I smiled faintly. "It wasn't just me," I replied. "It was everyone who decided enough was enough." He nodded, then turned to leave, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As twilight fell over Serenity Lane, I felt a deep sense of peace, not the naive kind I'd sought when I first arrived, but something stronger, a hard-earned understanding that peace isn't given, it's fought for, and sometimes standing your ground is the only way to find it.